I will introduce first our moderator for the night. We have Taylor Armerding, local syndicated columnist. I'm sure everybody has read something that he has written. Please, thank you for being here. Good luck. Then we have Eileen McAnneny, president of the independent and non-partisan Mass Taxpayers Foundation. Thank you for being here. And we have Chip Ford, executive director from Citizens for Limited Taxation. And Wendy Wakeman, director at Mass Fiscal Alliance. I'd like to thank them all for being here. We will start things off, and later on, things will be opened up for questions if time permits, which we're hoping it will. But enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I don't know if paper's going to get passed around, but the idea is that you're going to write questions down if you have them. Is that right, Scott? Okay. Okay, so if you think of questions right now, or if you have questions based on something that you hear us talking about, you can feel free to jot that down, and toward the end of the hour, we're going to have some time for questions from the audience. Thanks to Scott and to Ann and everybody else who has made this evening possible, and for inviting me to be here. I appreciate it. It's nice to be amid an endangered species, which I hope we can change. But my name's Taylor Armerding, as you heard. I write a column for the company that owns the Eagle Tribune, and that means that they sometimes appear in the Newburyport News, the Gloucester Times, and the Salem News, and then some other more direct. Am I coming through okay? All right. Can you hear me now? But basically, I've always been interested in how government works and politics and that sort of thing. And so basically what I try to do is look at an issue that people are talking about, and sometimes try to ask questions or bring up issues that aren't necessarily part of the discussion yet in order to try to start a discussion. And I guess I'd say that the thing that interests me the most in political debates is the side that seems to be better able to frame the debate. And the way you frame a debate is with the language that you use. And sometimes I feel like liberals are better at that than conservatives are. Not all the time, by any means. In fact, I thought whatever we think of the Donald, whether you support him or don't, I thought, had a sort of a Scott Brown moment when Scott Brown said that what I think somebody who was questioning him said the Ted Kennedy seat, and he says actually it's the people's seat, and that was like that was a moment that resonated with people. And yesterday or today, Trump was talking about Hillary, and he noted that her slogan is "I'm with her." That's one of her big campaign slogans, and he said, "I'm with you." And that's the kind of thing that people can remember, and it draws it defines things better than half an hour of rhetoric about something. So I'm very interested in the way we use language to frame our political debates. After the Orlando massacre, I hadn't heard. I had noticed that the president had gone from using the term gun control. He never says gun control anymore. He talks about common sense gun safety laws. I don't know if you've noticed that, but he's sort of erased control from the discussion, and pretty much everybody lets him do that. And after the shootings in Orlando, this was the first time I'd heard it. Maybe some of you have heard it. Instead of, well, people talk about assault weapons and things like that, but now they're talking about weapons of war. That's the phrase that I heard constantly following, that we don't need weapons of war in the hands of private citizens. So those are just two examples. However you come down on those issues, that's not what I'm talking about right here, but I am talking about how it does seem that it's really, really important if you want to even level the playing field. You need to learn how to talk about things in a way that people can remember it. Because if your opponent is able to frame it with phrases or language that are more memorable or things like that, you've already lost. So that's one of the things I try to do as a columnist, and thank you to those of you who read me from time to time. I appreciate the feedback I get. Most of it's negative, but occasionally I actually have really good arguments. I call them arguments because I think that's what they are, and I think a really good argument is a wonderful thing because we argue in a civil way, we don't insult each other, we don't get personal, we just talk about the issue. And so I appreciate hearing from anybody who wants to have a good argument. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
All right, can you hear? All right, very good. Thank you. I'm Eileen McAnneny, president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. I'm delighted to be here this evening. What the Taxpayers Foundation focuses on is the fiscal health of the Commonwealth. So we're really a fiscal watchdog. We've been around for 84 years. I think we have a lot of credibility on Beacon Hill. And so I'm delighted I took over for the Taxpayers Foundation about 15 months ago from Mike Widmer, who may be someone that you're all familiar with. But the work we do is incredibly important. And I would love to return, if we have time, to the point that Taylor made just about framing the debate in words matter. But at least from my perspective, having spent 20 years or more on Beacon Hill in a variety of capacities, but in the public policy realm, representing businesses, and that debate is often framed by others, and it feels like it's an uphill battle, and so I think it's important that we talk about that and see if there are ways to improve that conversation. So thanks.
I'm Chip Ford, newly promoted to Executive Director of Citizens for Limited Taxation by default. I noticed in the invitation that this event was dedicated to the legacy of Barbara Anderson, and as you know, she recently passed away. I've been with CLT since 1996, and I've been with Barbara about the same amount of time. As you probably know, Citizens for Limited Taxation is we call it the voice of the taxpayers. We were founded 42 years ago. We've given the taxpayers their money back in the form of Proposition 2.5 and property tax cap, which also included a renter's deduction and a reduction of your auto excise. The income tax rollback in 2000, which has got the income tax down from 5.85, or it was at the time, to 5.1%. We were hoping it was going to go to 5.05% next year, but that looks pretty iffy now with the present fiscal conditions of Beacon Hill. We're still open. Barbara worked her way up from the secretary at COL, volunteer to secretary to executive director in the middle of the Proposition 2.5 campaign. Working for CLT is not a job, it's a vocation. That's the way both she and I look at it. It's a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week job. And since she's been gone, I've learned how to squeeze 25 hours, 26 hours out of a day. The current issue we're looking at now is this proposed millionaire's tax. CLT defeated the last graduated income tax, grad tax, back in 1996, along with the help of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. In Massachusetts, we either have a flat tax or we don't. We have a flat tax, historically. But time after time after time, and this will be the 6th effort, the progressives, the liberals, the tax and spend cabal keeps coming back and coming back and coming back. They want a progressive income tax. This is the latest incarnation, the sixth one, and it's a little different, and it's going to be a little trickier to defeat. But that's the coming battle ahead. If we ever lose our flat tax, that is only step one. Divide and conquer will follow, and it will be forever because it's in the Constitution. The only way you ever get a constitutional amendment is if the legislature wants it. Constitutional amendments for term limits never got the 50 votes in the Constitutional Convention. The voters never had an opportunity to vote on it. Time after time, there was a constitutional amendment of all things for an automatic legislative pay raise. That got on the ballot. And it passed. The only things that get on the ballot as constitutional amendments are unpopular laws that the legislature itself doesn't want to vote on. But if somebody proposes it, like the group that keeps coming back for the grab tax, it will get through the Constitutional Convention, get on the ballot, no fingerprints. So we're going to have to watch this because, like I said, we either have a flat tax or we don't. And for the sixth time, the voters are going to have to make that decision. And that's probably going to be in 2018. So thanks for inviting me, and thanks for holding this in memory of Ivan's legacy, and keep fighting. We are a minority, but we can win.
Hello, I'm Wendy Wakeman. I'm on the board of directors at Mass Fiscal Alliance. Mass Fiscal Alliance advocates for fiscal responsibility, transparency, and accountability in state government and increased economic opportunity for the people of the Commonwealth. That's our mission statement. Many of you I know from previous things I've done in the Republican Party, managing Peter Torkelson's campaign, working for Peter when he was in Congress, working in the State House. I've been around a while. This is the most fun I have ever had working for issues of fiscal responsibility. Mass Fiscal does many of the same things that CLT and Mass Taxpayers Foundation talk about. We look at a lot of the same issues. We go after the bad guys with wild abandon. The first order of attack, we have a great legislative lobbyist, a woman named Lori Belcito. She comes to Mass Fiscal from the Heritage Foundation. She's incredibly sharp, she's incredibly savvy and sophisticated, and she works up on the Hill, going to the legislative offices, legislative hearings, keeps her ear to the ground so we know what's happening all the time. The second thing we do is our voter education. This is where things can get really fun. We organize the grassroots, and I encourage you all to visit massfiscal.org and sign up for our emails. What we do with your name once we have it is we let you know when there are issues coming before the legislature that need grassroots support, need your emails, need your calls, need you to get in touch with Lenny Mira and tell him to do the right thing. Is that right, Representative? Yes. Some of the places that we've been extremely effective, we did a huge effort to allow, to push the Senate to suspend the Pacheco law, which is this horrible procurement law, the worst law in the country, so that the T could actually make the changes it needed to make. And the way we did that was we bombarded both the chairman of the Democratic State Committee and the chairman of the committee, Mark Pacheco, Senator Pacheco, for whom the law is named, bombarded them with calls from their constituents saying, hey, look, you gotta give Charlie Baker the tools he needs. And we can't put up with this union sympathizing effort to keep the status quo at the T because we are in an urgent situation. And it was very effective, and we managed to give that tool to Governor Baker. We've also been mailing out the dirty dozen things into the districts of these folks. These are the legislators who voted in committee to allow Proposition 80. At Mass Fiscal, we never call it a millionaire's tax. That is the language of the other side, Taylor. We call it Proposition 80 because it increases taxes on the top percent by 80%, which is outrageous. absolutely outrageous. And as we all know, it's millionaires today, but tomorrow it's people who earn over $30,000 and have a job, because that window sash is going to fall on our heads when they don't get the revenue that they think they're going to get out of millionaires, who will, of course, flee the state. So the voter education stuff is a lot of fun. We're doing great things there. And then the final thing we do, although we do a lot of things, and there are some other things, we are trying to create a vigorous conversation around these issues. And we host national leaders in Boston and in the suburbs to bring in people who have other ideas, because Massachusetts suffers from being driven by one dominant idea. As we all know, we're the choir, and we sit around and we say, let's talk about a different way, let's talk about a different way, but alone our voices don't always get heard. So over the past couple of years, we've hosted Scott Walker, Carly Fiorino, John Kasich, all presidential candidates, to talk to some of the people here who are trying to motivate the same kinds of change. We had Paul Ryan visit just before he was elected Speaker of the House. We've had some really wonderful congresswomen, Republican congresswomen from around the country, and senators come and speak, especially to the state legislative aides, the Republican legislative aides, to encourage more people to go into politics and to see what's possible. That's a very important part of our work that I love very much. I cast around a bunch of these scorecards. This is our legislative scorecard. We keep track of the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of voting on Beacon Hill. It's a searchable database, and I encourage you all to go look at it. And if you look at our website, there's other good stuff there. So we'll talk more in a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. All right, we're going to start just with the panel here. I have a few questions that I thought about in advance, and then also just based on what you've heard from the other panelists. We're going to start having a little discussion on several issues, and like I said, if you have questions that you would like to ask, you need to write them down, and maybe in about 15-20 minutes we will take some questions from the audience. But I think you've been hearing about what the other side is calling the millionaire's tax, Wendy. and that's not all that they're saying. I do want to talk about the millionaire's tax, and I would like to talk about it sort of along the lines of what I was saying earlier about framing the debate, the language of the debate. I suspect all of you have heard that this is a tax that will only be on millionaires. You have heard that they can afford it. After all, they're richer than you are. And also, you've heard that they're not paying their fair share. Those are things that you hear constantly. And of course, they're designed, to convince people, but they're also designed to breed resentment, I think. And so, rather than just sort of throw up our hands or whatever, I have a couple of things a couple of thoughts on it, but I would like to hear from the panelists also. Is if we're going to oppose this in any kind of an effective way, you have to be able to try to frame the debate in a way that people can remember what you said. Unfortunately, or unfortunately, it sort of gets down to be a bumper sticker kind of thing. You need a phrase that people can remember, that they can kind of latch onto. And I think a good one is don't penalize success. I think that's a good one. But I think I was just reading in one of Chip Ford's emails today or yesterday about the way that the state government has grown from 10 billion to 40 billion in 30 years. And so it's an average of $1 billion a year that the state budget has increased. And maybe you could, there's a way to frame the debate. Has your pay gone up by that percentage? Not talking dollars, obviously, but has your pay increased at that percentage every year? The state is not starved for revenue. And there has to be a way, I think, to try to get people to be able to think about it in those terms. I used to write columns, I don't do it that much anymore, about public employee contracts, because I would kind of get into the weeds of those contracts. And I was having an argument with a union leader about the leader of a union, not the newspaper, the union leader. And he said, "Oh, you just hate unions." And I said, "No, I don't think so, any more than you hate taxpayers. Do you hate taxpayers?" And he says, "Oh, of course I don't. We're taxpayers." But the point is, once again, if you let them frame the debate, you've already lost it. So I'd be interested in hearing from the panelists. I'm assuming that they oppose this tax, and Chip Ford gave us a couple of really good reasons why we should oppose it, but I'd like to hear their comments on it. And why don't we start from the other end? Wendy, we'll start with you, and then we'll work our way in this direction.
Thank you. First of all, we have, over the past couple of months, absolutely decided that the phrase "the millionaire's tax" is something that just plays into the real cynicism that led to writing this law. It's the most cynical proposal I've ever read, because not only does it say we're going after millionaires, but it then says that we're giving the money to transportation and education, making it really hard for anybody to say that they wouldn't want to vote for this tax, because why wouldn't you want to take from the millionaires and give it to the children in the schools who need their buses? It's a crazily written law. I think that going after calling it something other than the millionaire's tax is important. I think, secondly, pointing out that the legislature is abdicating its responsibility. In even voting to put this on the ballot, the legislature abdicates its responsibility, because directing how that tax money is going to be used within the Constitution is just crazy, right? There's no reason why the Constitution should tell us how to spend our money, and that's why we elect good folk every couple of years. So those are two of the most important points that I'm kind of looking at. Does that address what you were asking, Taylor?
Yes, thank you.
Keep it simple, stupid. When we did the tax rollback in 2000, we could have gone into all the causes and reasons and arguments, but the one thing we focused on was keep the promise. It was supposed to be temporary back in 1989, keep the promise. In 1996, the fifth grad tax ballot question, this was right before I went to work for CLT. I was in the office on Tremont Street, sitting around with Barbara and Chip Faulkner and a few other people. And Barbara was raging against the professional consultants that were brought in from out of state that didn't have a clue about how people thought in Massachusetts. I was sitting there, I don't know if anybody knows, but I'm an illustrator by education. And I was sitting there with a legal pad just sketching. And she said, "We got to come up with a different message. The message they want us to use isn't going to work." And I was just sketching, and I sketched this bear trap. And I just wrote, "tax trap." And that immediately became, when I turned the pad around, everybody applauded. That immediately became our message. Grad tax. It's a graduated income tax. Grad tax. Tax trap. It's only a question of time. We either have a flat tax or we don't have a flat tax. And once they get the camel's nose under that tent, it's got to be bracket by bracket, divide and conquer. They'll raise one bracket at a time. Got to keep it simple. Like Taylor says, got to have a message. Keep the promise. It's a tax trap. How's that, Taylor?
I like it. Oh.
So the Mass Taxpayers Foundation is opposed to the ballot initiative, but I think it's really important that we be precise about what we're talking about, right? So this constitutional amendment doesn't impose a graduated income tax in the way that previous attempts have done, right? They learned from past mistakes. And what they're doing effectively is legislating through the Constitution. So they're very specific. They say that there will be a 4% marginal tax on income over $1 million, and that $1 million will be adjusted for inflation. So some of the arguments, because without getting too technical, but I think it's important you understand what's happening here, is that in previous attempts, what they've done is eliminated a uniformity clause in the Constitution that says all income has to be taxed the same. They deleted that, and then in a companion piece of legislation, they set rates, right? And we were able to defeat those initiatives because we said this year it's millionaires, next year it'll be people over 100,000, the year after that it'll be 50,000. Don't give the legislature that authority. But they've been very clever this time. So it specifies a 4% marginal tax in the Constitution, right? So the arguments about, next year it'll be on you actually aren't accurate because they would have to amend the Constitution again in order to do that. So that's why this time around it's going to be much more difficult because it's also happening in an environment where income inequality is front and center. So I think it's important that we try to tackle this in a number of ways. And what MTF is doing is we're looking at if there are legal ways to get it thrown out, right? And I think it's important for voters because initial polling says people support the tax because they want the money to go to education and transportation. Who wouldn't? If you drive on our roads, you're on the MBTA, it needs money, right? So people support that. If you ask them, would you support it if the money doesn't go to those things, support falls off precipitously. Like it's 70% favorability initially, and then if you say the money doesn't go to those things, it falls to about 25%. So it's really important. I think one of the messages is people have to understand that that money is not necessarily going for what they say, and it actually can't, because there's another provision in the Constitution that says you can't make a specific appropriation through the ballot initiative process, right? So if you did, it would be excluded and it couldn't be before the voters. So the proponents are trying to have it both ways. They're trying to say that the money will go to transportation and education, but if it was guaranteed to go there, it would be a specific appropriation and then it wouldn't be before the voters. So we think that there are some kind of technical ways that we might be able to get this thrown out. And for now, that's what MTF is focused on.
Could I make one comment?
Yeah.
Referring to your statement that, of course, you can't earmark through the Constitution, I think for those of us in this room, that's an important thing to remember. When the Attorney General approved this question to enter its next steps and allowed it to start going through the whole rigmarole to get to the ballot, I don't know what she was thinking, because it's written in a way that flies in the face of constitutional law. And when the legislators who voted in favor of allowing it to continue, I don't know what they were thinking. Because, again, this sort of earmarking isn't allowed within the Constitution. It's one of the most frustrating parts of the debate. It's why we need to look at electing constitutional office holders as well as state reps and state senators.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate that. So, yeah, I think even if it was the case that the law is written so that it couldn't, next year it couldn't go after people who make $250,000 and then lower and lower. It still is true. Certainly all millionaires won't leave the state, but it might be a way to frame the argument that right now a millionaire pays $50,000 to Massachusetts. If he leaves, he won't be paying $90,000. He'll be paying zero, and that that might be something to keep in mind, and it might be something people would be willing to think about. Yes.
The thing to remember is precedent too. While this constitutional amendment targets millionaires, once that becomes established and accepted and common knowledge, how long will it take before the next constitutional amendment is proposed? And it will be. And it will go through that legislature, and it will get that 50 votes that it needs. I promise you it will. And then it'll be people making $100,000 or $150,000. And then it may take a number of years, but either you have a flat tax or you do not have a flat tax. This will establish the precedent that we do not have a flat tax. we have a two-tiered tax for now.
Thanks. That's good.
You know, and I would just say, whoops, before we move off the subject, the tax liability is much higher than that because the Department of Revenue is estimating that it'll bring in between 1.6 and 2.2 billion dollars, and they're estimating that it impacts 19,500 taxpayers. So essentially, for the people who would be subject to it, their tax liability is going up about $100,000 on average, which is pretty sizable. And you know, I think to Taylor's point about people potentially leaving the state, that certainly is a big concern of ours. And the only other thing I would say is Massachusetts relies a lot on capital gains tax revenue, right? And it's a very volatile source of revenue. It follows the stock market. But there's a law on the books currently that says, you know, any tax revenue in excess of roughly $1 billion that the state receives should go into the stabilization fund or the state's, you know, bank account, savings account, to be used for one-time things, right? A lot of millionaires' income is capital gains, right? So we have a question about how does that play out? Will the money be going to education and transportation, or will it be going to the stabilization fund to build up reserves? Because we're essentially, you know, you can't direct one source of income to two places. So that's another concern.
You say you can't spend money twice? That's what my parents told me. All right, thank you, everybody. I have a question about the minimum wage that has been a campaign, as you know, in different states, and different states have different minimum wages. And so I'd like to see what the panelists think about that issue. I've been told, I've read in a number of places, I've been told that $1 of wages generates between $1.70 and $2 worth of economic activity. I've heard that from all kinds of think tanks and stuff. So I still, that, you know, if that were the case, then I think everybody should be making $150 an hour, and, you know, then we could all ride off into a glorious sunset of economic prosperity. But so I'm kind of interested in your view of that. But in general, I also think that part of the discussion needs to focus on what government controlling the minimum wage does to jobs. It's interesting to me that it seems like almost every time the minimum wage goes up, then as soon as summer comes, I read that, you know, the governor or mayors are saying we got to create more. We need more government funding so that kids can get summer jobs. You know, because there aren't any, and they never stop to think, at least from what I've gathered, they never stop to think, well, maybe it's too expensive to hire people who have no skills and teach them a skill. So, among the arguments, well, I already mentioned that. Do you think government should set the minimum wage? Why or why not? And if so, what do you think the minimum wage in Massachusetts ought to be and why? And we'll start with Eileen, please.
So, Mass Taxpayers doesn't take a position on the minimum wage, but I will say this. I think if you make the cost of something more expensive, then, you know, stands to reason the demand for it will go down. And you know, one thing that I will say is we do look periodically at the costs of doing business in the Commonwealth. And it's really important for lawmakers to understand that there's more than one economy in the state, and it's easy if you're, you know, on Beacon Hill and you see all the cranes to think that the entire state is booming, much like Boston. But from our work, if you look at places out in western Massachusetts, the average wage there is less than the average wage in the nation. And most people think of Massachusetts as a high wage state, right? But that actually isn't the case. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, even if you buy into the argument that like Boston can absorb a higher minimum wage, and I don't personally, those wages are just not sustainable in a place like Springfield or Pittsfield or Leominster. And so I think it's really important for lawmakers to understand that there's different regional economies, and it can hurt a lot of the manufacturers and folks that operate on low margins. So, I think that the key word in that is minimum wage, and it's not supposed to be a wage that you sustain a family on and so forth. You'd want to try to have people aspire to better jobs and higher wages. So I think the notion that we have to establish a wage that allows people the minimum wage to support a family is probably we're barking up the wrong tree.
CLT has no position on this either. And generally, I agree with Eileen. I don't see that, especially if you look at the federal level. The federal government wants to establish a national minimum wage and talk about getting far away from the home front. What you're seeing, though, in places that are artificially raising the minimum wage, and like Taylor said, I mean, if a $10 minimum wage is good, why not jack it up to $50? But if you look at some of the places that are raising the minimum wage, you're seeing a loss of employment. Obviously, an employer only has so much income, revenue the government calls it, coming into their treasury. They can't spend what they don't have. So if they've got to pay a higher minimum wage, they have to hire lower people or raise the cost of the product and lose business. So generally, I don't believe the government should be involved in it at all. But as Eileen said, it's got to be more localized, and then you vote with your feet. It's very similar to the meals tax in Massachusetts, where each town can decide to raise its own meals tax, and you don't have to eat in that town, you can eat in the next town.
Mass Fiscal is opposed to the proposal on the table currently to raise the minimum wage. And I'd like to carry this discussion off into a slightly different direction, Taylor. One of the things we care a lot about is transparency. And we believe that better government comes when we know what's happening in Beacon Hill. So a few months ago, the Committee on, is it still Commerce and Labor? A committee reported out a favorable report for a bill that would raise the minimum wage substantially. I'm terrible with numbers. So if anyone in the room knows the exact numbers, feel free to correct me. But at any rate, this joint committee has something like 17 members on the committee. And when that report was issued, the report was issued with 5 people voting in favor of the higher minimum wage and 3 people voting against this proposal to raise the minimum wage. So it left committee with a favorable report. In other words, the committee that was supposed to look at the legislation said, okay, House of Representatives, Senate, we want you to vote in favor of this. We've investigated it. We want you to vote in favor of it. Well, that's only 8 people voting. What happened to the other people who were on the committee who are supposed to vote, and why didn't they vote? And who were the people who voted in favor of issuing it out of committee? And who were those few heroes who stood up and voted against issuing it from committee with a favorable report? We don't know any of that because those votes aren't public record. Take a minute to let that sink in. We have a committee of reps and senators who we charge with studying this bill for everybody, for the whole 200 members in the legislature, but they can hide underneath the table with the tablecloth and not let anyone know how they're voting. I'm fairly certain that's not why I elect my rep or my senator, and I'm fairly certain that that means they're not earning the salaries we're paying them.
Thank you very much. Just one last thought on it. I think it might be, it might resonate with people to mention that, I don't know if you can fit it on a bumper sticker, but even the Office of Management and Budget says that if you raise the minimum wage, there's going to be a decline in employment. And so I think it's important to put out there that if you don't have a job, your minimum wage is 0. So, whatever, whatever the, whatever it's set at, if you don't get the job, you have nothing. You're not making anything. All right, we have a couple of questions from our audience, and this first one, what exactly, and that's underlined, ladies and gentlemen, what exactly would you cut from our spending in order to balance the state budget? And we'll start with Wendy.
It's my turn to go first. I get to tell you all this great anecdote that I told Taylor when I came in tonight. Mass Fiscal is very lucky to have great access to the people who are running the authorities and the agencies as we go forward and try to look at ways that things can change. So recently we had Brian Schwartzleaves, who's the executive director at the MBTA, come and talk to us about the issues that he's facing there. And the things he said would certainly curl the hair on your toes. And I'll give you just one little example. He said the first thing he did when he took office, they've been very laid back about things. They're not trying to be go, rah, cut, lay off. He said to the senior managers around the table, so have y'all ever gone out and asked our vendors for discounts? And there wasn't a peep. And he said, so you've never sort of asked for a volume discount or asked for a way that we could save some money here? And everybody said, well, no, that's really not how we do business. So he said, well, let's change that, because in the private sector, we ask for discounts all the time. So why don't you go to your vendors and ask for discounts? And of course, one of the biggest expenses at the T is office supplies, because if you work for the state, you get great office supplies. And they work with WB Grace. And the MBTA is, in fact, WB Grace's largest customer. And the T person said, so can you give us a discount? And WB Grace jumped up and down and cheered and said, absolutely, we can give you a discount. We would love to give you a discount. Here's the thing. The MBTA is the last customer who still orders everything by fax. And we actually pay a person to do nothing but stand next to the fax machine, receive faxes from the MBTA, and get them out to the proper places. So we are more than willing to give you a nice big discount, MBTA, if you would only switch to doing your ordering on computer. So there is one example of somewhere that we could save some serious money. And there are examples like this throughout government. Barbara used to have a wonderful analogy. She used to talk about, people would say to her, but you can't cut money out of government because the fat's all marbled through it like a wonderful roast beef. And you really just can't get that fat out. And Barbara would say, well, what you do is you turn the heat on and you leave the heat on all day and you just let that fat melt out and you keep the heat on them until the fat's gone. And there's the truth.
CLT, and we were asked this question constantly. And so back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we set up a special section on our website called Where to Cut. And for years we maintained that, adding to it. When people kept asking us, where would you cut? We say, go to the website. This is the first time I've heard that question in about 10 years. We stopped keeping the list because it was one of those questions that's supposed to tie you in knots. Where would you cut? Well, we gave them a lot of places where they could cut billions of dollars over those years until they stopped asking the question.
So I would agree certainly with Wendy. I think that the MBTA is a good place to start. They are making some progress. There's a lot more to be made. But for the first time in about 15 years, they've kept the growth in operating expenses at zero, right? And the reason it's important is because in addition to the sales tax revenue that gets dedicated to the MBTA each year, we also provide what's called additional contract assistance, right? And so, the idea, they tried to put the MBTA on a budget, right? And like everyone else, you'd get a certain amount of money at the beginning of the year and you had to live within your means. That hasn't actually worked, and so what the state does typically at the end of the year, they provide the difference, right? So if the MBTA has exceeded that amount of money, they provide the difference in what's called additional contract assistance. In this year, it's going to be 187 million, but in a couple of years, it's going to grow to about 425 million, and that's a big chunk of change for the state when you think about revenues are growing year over year at roughly $1 billion, right? And so it's really important that the MBTA begin to control its expenses for a number of reasons, but there's an impact on the state budget. The other place I would look is the Mass Health Program. If you think about it, the state has about 1.8 million people in the Mass Health Program out of a population of about 6.6 million. So, certainly over 25%. And Massachusetts is one of the wealthiest states in the nation, always in the top 5. So you do have to question, how can that many people be on the Mass Health Program? And I think it's really important that we understand what's driving that growth, because really Mass Health is cannibalizing a lot of the other areas of the budget. So until we get a handle on that, there's going to be just enormous pressure on the rest of the budget.
Thank you. All right, we have, I don't know if we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. We're closing in on about 7 or 8 minutes. But I'll try to get to them as many as we can. Here's one from the audience. In your opinion, which is more effective for boosting the Massachusetts economy? And then the 2 options are 1 tax-free weekend or a lower sales tax overall. And I think, Eileen, you start this time.
I would say probably a lower sales tax, just from the mere fact that if you miss that weekend, it's 1 weekend of the year, right? And so a lower sales tax would have more of an impact and a longer term impact. But obviously, we compete with our neighboring states too, and to the extent that New Hampshire doesn't have one, I think that would help.
I agree entirely. Lowering the sales tax. Again, that used to be 5%. I don't know what happened, why 5% was enough. Now, we're talking percent, not dollars amounts. Why 5% was good enough for as long as that lasted. And if you remember, it started out at 3%. But the income tax was 5%, the sales tax was 5%. I think both should go back to 5%. Keep in mind, as Taylor mentioned before, I was going through old VCR tapes, trying to find some video for Barbara's remembrance event we had. And I came across all this information about the 1986 surtax repeal. The budget then, the argument was whether it should be $9 billion or $10 billion. We're talking now about almost $40 billion, $39.5 billion. In the same period of time, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, inflation went up. If $100 in 1986 is worth $218 today, a little more than double. The state budget since 1986 has quadrupled. Let's roll the income tax and the sales tax back to 5% where it was.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add other than that the sales tax weekend is really pretty patronizing, isn't it? It's a gimmick in which our state reps and senators say to us they've done something nice to us by taking away the pain they usually inflict.
Thank you very much. And I do, as we all know, I think it's worth mentioning that it's not really a tax-free weekend because there's a limit on what you can buy, or the price of what you can buy. So, it's kind of like, I think that is another patronizing element of the tax-free weekend. I also agree completely that it would be much better to just have a lower sales tax overall and forget about the gimmicks, because that is a gimmick. Okay, we'll do one more here. Let's see. I don't know how to answer this. I don't know if anybody else can. And it's a national question about, but it has to do with healthcare. If Obamacare is so great, why are not federal and state employees on it? I think I heard that, but then I thought that was debunked on Snopes or something. Do you know? Because I don't, I'm sorry to say.
I mean, I think federal employees are, but not congressmen. I think so. That's my understanding.
Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. All right, we had, for Wendy, if we sign up at massfiscal.org, will we be informed about the many speakers whom you have invited or will invite? Is the public invited? You're transparent, aren't you?
Most of the time we're pretty transparent. I will admit that some of these events come at a cost, and some of these events are available to people who give at a certain level, but other events are available to the general public, yes.
And Chip, there's a quick question for you. What is the current health, well, this is from an admirer of your organization, as we all are, I think. What is the current health of the organization, and should we worry about its viability?
Well, we're all going to sure miss Barbara, as her opponent, Jim Browdy, for years, and good friend, said, called her a force of nature never to be seen again. But one of the promises I had to make to her before she passed on, along with taking care of her cat and a number of other things, was to keep CLT going. And we have every intention to keep it going. There'll never be another Barbara, but CLT isn't going away.
Okay, I think that we don't really have time for another question. I would like, on a personal note, to say that I was a constant fan and admirer of Barbara Anderson. I thought she had one of the quickest minds I've ever encountered. She was very kind to me and would compliment me from time to time on columns that I wrote. But whenever I had a discussion with her about anything, it was like she had multiple volumes of encyclopedias in that mind, and she just could recall things that I would have to go Google before I'd be able to figure out what they were. So I'm so thankful. I think we should all be thankful for her life and dedication. And one of the things I admire the most, and that I hope her legacy will be, is that she didn't make it about her. She made it about everybody. She made it about the taxpayers. She was their advocate. She wasn't looking to become a hero or a star or a celebrity or anything like that. It was the issues that she was dedicated to. So I hope that we can try to carry on some of that attitude in what we do. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.